We needed the wind to speed us on our way. Having asked Njord to give us strong winds and calm seas, the sailors began to row with all their might, but out into the ocean in a northerly direction. Depending on the winds, our journey could take anywhere from 10 to 20 days to complete. On board there was one sailor who had already journeyed to Iceland several times before. His knowledge of the ocean waters was invaluable or very useful, and he clearly ruled the roost. As we traveled, other sailors watched the ocean currents, observed the behavior of the seabirds and sea mammals, and looked into the stars at the position of the sun for direction. All of this enabled them to steer an accurate course across the ocean. After we lost sight of land, the sailors stopped rowing, and just as Tully had said they would, they raised the mainsail. I noticed that they were using a weather vane to show the wind direction. As the day progressed, the wind picked up and we began to move swiftly across the ocean. Tully and I were not just passengers, we had work to do on board the ship. We were responsible for adding to the food supplies by fishing as well as helping to cook. As the sun began to set on our first day on board the ship, Tully and I fished and talked about home. We were lucky. Within a short time we caught several large white fish. We gutted and deboned them and then cut them up into pieces, ready to be placed into a large cooking pot. For the fire was started in a large cauldron. The cauldron was suspended from an iron tripod. A smaller pot for cooking was hung over the fire. We had a plentiful supply of salted and smoked meat on board. It was stored in several large, dry barrels. We would be able to make bread each day as well. We had some chickens, too. Fresh water was kept in special barrels that were sealed to keep out salt water. As one day led to another, Tully and I quickly established a routine on board the ship. We would begin the day by fishing, then we would wash and help prepare breakfast for the crew and the others on board. After breakfast, we would help clean the deck and give out supplies of drinking water. We would tend to the fire in the cauldron, and when late afternoon came, we would once again cast our fishing lines into the ocean. One evening when we were fishing, Tully told me an interesting story about the place that would soon be our new home. Do you know, Bjorn, who was the first successful Viking to settle in Iceland? Tully asked. I told Tully that I could not remember. He shook his head, winked at me, then continued. It was the valiant Ingolfur Arnarson, also known as just Ingolf. Others had tried before, but had failed. He was determined to succeed. Ingolf did not know where the best place to settle was, so he asked the gods to help him. He cast wooden posts into the ocean and waited for them to wash ashore. When they did, he began to build the settlement we now call Reykjavik on that very spot. Tully loved to talk, and he often had stories about our brave warriors and explorers. Much to Tully's disappointment, we did not encounter any sea monsters on our voyage. One day, however, a large fish flew right up out of the water while we were fishing and scared us both half to death. The wind was with us all the way, and after 2 days of sailing north, we shifted our course and sailed west. Apart from 2 nights of heavy rain, our journey was easy and uneventful. We completed our voyage in good time, catching our first sight of land at midday on the 14th day. As we sailed closer to Reykjavik, we could see the mountains rising up into the clouds, some with snow still coating the tops, as well as large areas of beautiful, green pastureland. The houses had green grass growing right on the roofs, as if the fields were growing on top of them. There wasn't any impressive wharf like the one in our hometown. Instead, there was a small, muddy harbor area. A large group of people stood in the mud waiting for our ship to arrive. As we approached, I could tell that many of them were simply curious bystanders. All the people in Iceland lived on farms in the countryside. A sailor who had been to Iceland before told us that it was always exciting for the Icelanders when a ship from Norway arrived. People gathered at the shore to see what was happening, get news from Norway, and see whether there were goods to be traded. Tully and I disembarked the ship and walked toward the crowds of people. Although we didn't know anyone, the inhabitants of this new land looked strangely familiar. They looked and talked just like the people back home. We walked slowly, mingling with the crowd and taking in the new sights and sounds. Twice we had to explain to a small boy that we were not interested in buying a falcon that he appeared to be selling, although Tully did stop for a moment to consider whether or not it would be advantageous for him to own a bird of prey. We had never met our uncles Valley and Tooney, as they had left our homeland before we were born. In many ways, they would be our newly adopted fathers. Suddenly, a man the size of a bear with a long, untrimmed beard came charging toward us. He grabbed hold of me and then clapped Tully hard on the back. "Nephews, welcome to Iceland. Not much, I know, but you'll get to like it. I would know you anywhere. I am your Uncle Vali," he explained and then laughed out loud. "How was your journey? How are your parents? Your cousins cannot wait to meet you. I expect you are hungry." Uncle Valley continued to talk and ask questions, all at the same time. He did not seem to need any answers to his questions, and so Tully and I simply nodded or agreed with almost everything he said as we followed him through the streets of our new town. Our legs felt very shaky as we walked through the muddy streets. Having been at sea for so many days, we still had our sea legs and were not yet used to firm ground. It was a strange feeling, and on a number of occasions I thought I was going to fall flat on my face in the mud. After several minutes of walking through the same kind of narrow, muddy streets as the ones we had left behind, I began to hear some familiar sounds. We were approaching Uncle Valley's forge. He was a blacksmith like my father, and I would be working as an apprentice with him and his son Iver, whereas Tully would be farming with Uncle Tooney and his family. As we approached my uncle's longhouse, I could see immediately that it was quite different from our house at home. It was one of the longhouses that had grass growing right on top of it. "I wonder if they graze their cows up there," Tully whispered with a grin on his face. "These turf homes keep us nice and warm," Uncle Tooney explained as he noticed our reaction to the house. "Come inside, there are many people waiting to meet you." As we entered my uncle's home, I could see immediately that, although the outside was different, the inside was not. It contained one long, dimly lit central hall. There was also a large hearth around which many people were sitting. Once inside, I caught the smell of something really good. The aroma seemed to be coming from a large iron pot suspended above the hearth. I just hoped it wasn't fish. Immediately, a lady, a little older than my mother, ran towards us. "Welcome to your new home. I am your Aunt Turid," she smiled and then turned to call to the rest of the family. "Tooney, come and meet your nephews. Astrid, Hillid, Rolf, Iver, Sigrid, come meet your cousins." Within seconds, we were surrounded by, until now, unknown family members. Uncle Tooney stepped forward and greeted us. I was surprised by how much he looked like my father. He was quiet like him, too. Then a number of girls and boys of various ages stepped forward to say hello. Finally, an older lady, who was introduced to us as Grandmother Gunrun, beckoned us toward the hearth. As we sat on the floor, she began to serve us the evening meal. It was a beef stew, and it tasted really good. Tully and I ate eagerly. Once we had eaten, Aunt Turid led us toward two raised earthen beds in the very back of the longhouse. They were covered in animal furs. "You should rest," she said softly. "You have had a long journey. Tomorrow your new life will begin with us." Then she smiled and walked away. Toller responded by throwing himself down upon his new bed and immediately falling asleep. I sat in the darkness for a long time and thought about my childhood days and my family, my journey to my new home, and all of the things that might lie ahead. I knew that when I awoke the next day, I would no longer be a child.